We're seeing historical shocks in the Arabica market where coffee supply is no longer being stored in warehouse at the levels we expected it to. Companies are having to be way more flexible. Whereas before they said, I'm providing a Central American coffee and it's got all these attributes to it. That region experiences a climate shock or a production shock, and they're now subbing in Robusta coffee from Vietnam. I mean, this is the consumers used to a certain type of flavor profile, and these companies are all starting to think, well, how do I solve this for the future? The fundamental business economics are actually being challenged. And that's why all these companies are investing in climate change. It's not out of the goodness of their hearts.
Hey, climbers, welcome back to another episode of Climb by VSC. I am excited to have on a friend and fellow investor, Shayna Harris, who is one of the founding partners of Supply Chain Capital. Shayna, you've spent your entire career in food, sustainability, and innovation. So it's going to be the theme of a lot of our conversations today, in addition to obviously we're both early stage investors. And so talking a lot about the founder journey. Before we get into all of that, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me in person on
Thank you
Climb.
so much for having me. It's exciting to be here in
This is
person.
very first time we're meeting in person
I
too.
can't
After how
believe
many
that.
years?
Years of Zoom.
This
So
is
it's
crazy.
a treat.
This is
Yeah.
crazy. Well, I hinted at your background a little bit. So before we dive into some of the companies that you've backed and some of the work that you've done, um, let's talk about Shayna. Give me the background. How did you find yourself in the food sustainability innovation world?
Great question. So I've spent the last 20 years in food and sustainability. It
Yeah.
is my passion. I actually started off as an activist out of college because what I really wanted to do was work on sustainable agriculture.
Yeah.
I have a family history in farming, and the truth of the matter is that most of the world's farmers have a hard time making it on farm. And when I realized that that was connected to social and environmental impact, that was kind of my life's calling. So I started out, as I mentioned, as an activist. I was working on trade justice campaigns, World Trade Organization reform, a lot of wonky things.
Yeah.
But which really got me thinking about the role of the private sector in sustainability. This was in the early 2000s. And I started to realize that the world's largest companies, Starbucks was up and coming at the time, Unilever was already a behemoth, they were starting to really think about their supply chains, thinking about the commodities they were buying, thinking about how to secure the supply, thinking about climate change, a lot of the things we'll talk about today, but 15, 20 years ago,
Yeah.
and not really sure how to figure it out because the commodity markets were developed in a way where goods were bought and sold anonymously. And they needed to kind of flip that script. So, over time, with this drive around sustainability and food systems, I started to really think about the corporate sector and innovation. And that was kind of how my journey started.
Yeah.
I went to business school, and out of business school, spent a number of years at Mars, really helping Mars really rethink their global commodity supply chains. I worked on cocoa, which the company spends $1 billion a year on. It is the largest commodity they buy, and it's in
And
your
Mars, the
favorites like
chocolate
M and
company,
M's
right?
and
Yeah.
exactly, and all of these products. And it was so interesting during that work because as I did that work, we had to really find innovative solutions and really think about how to use technology to secure these huge commodity supply chains for
Yeah.
these large conglomerates. And that's when I started really interacting a lot more with entrepreneurs, innovation. We started thinking about how do we partner?
Yep.
And I realized that there was a large role for me to play in the innovation ecosystem and to be able to move these solutions to market faster.
Yeah, the really interesting thing that I've seen as an early stage investor is, there's so many layers to our kind of food innovation ecosystem, right?
Yes.
We're looking at obviously the better for you movement and the direct to consumer brands that we see and all of that. But then underlying that is the materials itself. It's the way those materials get to us.
Yep.
And then it's the financing ecosystem, equity, debt, so on and so forth, that allows those things to get to us. So
That's exactly right.
kind of talking about what you're doing now,
Mhm.
you've gone and raised over 40 million for your own fund with your
Yes.
partner. Tell me about that origin story. Why was venture capital the right model to kind of go and approach some of these problems that you were seeing in your years in the industry?
Yeah. So it was really interesting. So I spent the first decade of my career in big food, thinking about big food. So did my co-founder, Nora May. Nora May and I co-founded Supply Chain Capital 3 years ago, but we've known each other since 2009 when we were at MIT together in business
Oh, okay,
school.
great.
But we both spent this first decade of our career, like she's an aerospace engineer at Boeing, moving products to market, launching satellites, working on big tech. I'm thinking about similar challenges within the supply chain of big food. And it was very interesting because in the second part of our career, this last decade has really been around innovation investing startups.
Yep.
What happened was in our own ways, we both started to peel back the onion and realize that all roads led to financing. What solutions were getting investment? And these are solutions you're thinking 5, 10, 15, 20 years out, where is the innovation headed?
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time at the Media Lab when I was at MIT doing my business degree. And these are, founders working and entrepreneurs working on generational problems. They're thinking 3 decades out. And we were really grasping for those solutions while we were in the private sector, both at Mars and at Boeing. And so as we both peeled the onion back in our own ways, we arrived to venture capital. For me, part of the story is I left Mars to join a venture-backed startup called Farmers Fridge in Chicago.
Mhm.
I oversaw some pretty substantial growth there from seed to Series C. And it was interesting because we were a company producing food, but using technology to do that more efficiently. And so as we were growing the company, we needed solutions around food safety software. We needed better ERP and supply chain systems. And I started to realize that the industrial food system wasn't set up to do this for a healthier product, which is what the consumer wanted today.
Yep.
I spent a lot of time with VCs, pitching VCs, and then with our investors, and realized that there was a real opportunity for somebody with my industry background to go directly into investing.
Yeah.
And Nora May was following a similar path and journey into VC, and that's when we decided to launch the
That's
fund.
great.
Yeah.
And so beyond sort of just your backgrounds, I mean, what do you feel differentiates supply chains? And I asked that question
Yeah.
kind of knowing some of the answer, but for our listeners' context, I mean, there's 800 new venture funds raised in
Yes.
2021. Not that many, but still a lot of funds raised in sort of 22 and even this year. There is a lot of venture capital out there. So
Yeah.
when you are meeting founders, what differentiates supply chain
Yeah.
capital for them?
We asked ourselves the exact same question when we launched, and we did kind of an ecosystem map, which is on our website and our blog, to figure out who was in this investment world that we were in. Because what really differentiated us when we were thinking about thesis is we were not only looking at the supply side, what needed to happen because of the climate and the environmental crisis we're facing, about how the food gets to our plate. We were also thinking a lot about culture. What's shifting on the demand side? We're two women that lead this investment firm. Most of the purchasing decisions in the US are made by women, yet women are leading a very small percentage of startups in the United
Yeah.
States. The demographics of this country are changing, as we both know really well. So by 2050, there will be no minority, it's a majority minority. And that has tons of implications for what we buy and how we want to eat it. We're also seeing these health trends around allergens, around diets, around health driven diseases that really need solutions. So for us, what we put together was thinking about the supply and demand. So across the supply chain, how do we change that? Thus, supply chain capital is born. So
Yeah.
that's what differentiates us thesis wise. What differentiates us as investors is we come with an operating background. And that really does make a difference for the founders we're working with. We hear this time and time again. So the way we've structured our investments is once we invest, all of our founders can access support from executive coach to think through how to build their business, all the fundamentals that we really felt like are big barriers for early stage entrepreneurs to being successful. We're trying to help them address. We're trying to help them shortcut. We're trying to help them think about, how do I establish my culture? What should my first hires look like? How do I let go of my Legos, which is a famous article we love, as I grow my business,
Yeah.
right? And so that really does differentiate us. And we get such positive feedback from founders we're working with because of that. We've also now started to make investments in companies that our founders are recommending to other founders.
That's great.
So I feel like that's the greatest NPS score.
Yes.
But so it's this combination of really understanding the food supply chain and thinking about not just the demand side, but the supply side, and being operators ourselves that really help us stand out in the market.
I think that second piece is so important. One of the things that my partner Vijay and I talk about a lot is kind of where the next decade of venture is heading, right? And we've had this flurry of capital activity in 2021 where anybody who, not anybody, but a lot of folks that wanted to raise
Mhm.
could find the capital to go raise.
Mhm.
Probably not enough folks that come from underrepresented backgrounds, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Now we're kind of in this phase where the capital markets have shifted back a little bit,
Mhm.
and founders have to be selective about who they take capital from, and investors are getting more selective about their time.
Mhm.
And I love the aspect of saying, look, we're leading with our operating experience, we're leading with founder coaching,
Mhm.
and helping founders understand how to navigate not just the business challenges of building stuff your customers want,
Mhm.
but also the challenges of building a company that people want to work at, and kind of
Yes.
scales that way. And
Yeah.
it's talked about a lot, and I think it's followed through less and less by fund managers.
100%. And what's so interesting is we walk the talk. So we work with an executive coaching firm called Verdi Associates. They work with all of our founders as well.
Yeah.
And the coach from Verdi Associates, Laura Greenberg, also coached me when I was in my prior role at
Oh,
Farmers
that's great.
Fridge as an operator. And one of the things she taught me is there's so many chasms you need to cross as a founder and or an early stage operator and executive. And so how do you develop the resilience and the mental flexibility and gymnastics to cross those chasms over time? And the founders that really make it successfully, build great cultures and great companies, can cross those chasms, and you need help to do it.
Yeah.
Just like all of us could use in our personal life. It's this very similar patterns you see personally and professionally. So we think it's such a critical part of being successful as an early stage founder. And there will be group sessions that are just issues that all founders face. So
Yeah.
like the founders listening to this podcast will understand this. Like, I need to hire someone. How do I put that job description together? What should I look for in the interview besides or beyond the resume, right? So that's a module that founders will go through together as a cohort. It's just these questions that come up very commonly. But then for each founder, we're all coming to this work with our own background, our own experiences, our own traumas. And so there's individual coaching as well that help you get like, what are those mental blocks that are preventing me from getting to the next stage and crossing that chasm? So it's a bit of a mix of like group support and group topics that you're going to be facing as your company building, as well as like, what are some individual lessons and skills I need to
Yeah.
learn?
And I empathize so much with that challenge. I think as two folks that have raised our own funds,
Yes.
you find yourself in that position of when you're projecting sort of one story externally, and then there's the day-to-day of actually running that company and the dissonance sometimes of the CEO, which is a very lonely job. And I think a lot of CEOs listening, we see you and we understand
Mhm.
that it's a
And we
very
understand that because we are
'cause
our own
our own
entrepreneurs
sort
and
of,
CEOs.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a lonely kind of job, and that dissonance of having to project, you know, strength and everything is going
Yeah.
great. And I honestly I wish more founders talked about the
Yeah.
fact that uh it's not always up and to the right. That's
Yeah.
not the stage of the journey. And really at no stage of the journey is it always up and to the right.
Mhm.
There are always challenges that are being faced. I guess where I'll take that question a little bit is you have a wide array of founders and wide array of companies at all stages of that stack that I talked about. Are there unifying principles of what you look for in a founder or company that
Mhm.
makes them a right investment for you?
Absolutely. So, I mean, we invest early, pre-seed and seed, pre-revenue or with some revenue traction,
Yeah.
pre-product or the beginning of a product, right? So we really strive to be those first investors coming in, those early institutional investors, helping founders get on the right path. And so what we're very much looking at is the idea, the problem that's being solved and the idea to solve it, and the founder. I mean, those are like the two fundamental pieces of the puzzle because we know that our companies are going to go through so many iterations. And I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
One of the companies we invested in, HyfÃ, led by Michelle Ruiz and Andrea Schoen. So when this company was started, Michelle, who is a wastewater engineer at ExxonMobil, was trying to solve a problem that her family had, which is that her family was experiencing diet related challenges because of what they were eating. A little known fact, I think, to the general public, but very talked about in the food world, is that 3/4 of our diet come from just 12 crops and 5 animals.
Really?
Yeah. So like corn, sugar, like all of the things that you think about in our diet, high fructose corn syrup, right? Eating too much sugar in our diets, animal protein,
Yeah.
right? We know how much beef contributes to cardiovascular challenges. Everything needs to be in moderation, right? All these crops play a role in our diets, but when we're over indexing in any of them, there's a lot of health challenges that are caused. And so Michelle's family was facing a lot of these diet related health challenges. And so she thought, how can I help my family eat their favorite foods? Her example was a high protein tortilla
Yeah.
where we take the high processed flour, highly processed ingredients out of that. Okay, so this her idea was I'm looking at all of these food processing facilities and breweries and they're flushing all this they're paying to get their water hauled away and just flushed into, basically polluting in landfill and water systems. There's sugar content in that water that's really valuable. How can we use it? So her idea was, can I clean this wastewater or surplus water from food processing and brewery facilities into a flour? I can create it into a flour that's high protein, allergen free, and it can go into my family's favorite foods, breads,
Mm.
tortillas, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So this is her idea. We leaned in with tons of questions about how this actually gets done at
Yeah.
scales, but she had incredible background. She understood the problem she was trying to solve. She lived it. She is a wastewater engineer. And then her co-founder, Andrea, who came together with her, worked at LanzaTech and created all the IP infrastructure on LanzaTech, which ultimately helped that company exit. So we thought this is a formidable team,
Yeah.
right? They understand the challenge they're trying to solve, and they have a very, very impressive skill set. This company is going to go through lots of twists and turns, right? But we're here for them in the beginning. We believe in this team. What they've ended up doing is pivoting the company. So we were one of the early investors in the pre-seed. In the seed round, they've pivoted. They successfully closed the seed round, led by synthesis. And what they're actually looking at is how do we create inputs into the alternative protein industry, feedstocks, which is a huge bottleneck to
Yeah.
creating these products
Yep.
affordably. And so essentially, they're creating a map to understand and match what types of wastewater matches with what types of feedstocks for the alternative protein industry. What's very interesting about this is an ingredient or a Cargill will pay a lot of money to have that wastewater cleaned. When it's cleaned, the byproduct gets put into landfill and it emits greenhouse gas. It's
Yeah.
it's an emission, it's an emitter, right? So what's really interesting about this, it ends up being a win-win for a large company to be able to get a useful byproduct out of their wastewater and to be able to reuse that water in their factory. So
Hmm.
there's a number of factors that she's actually tackling as she's helping companies achieve their carbon reduction goals, right? Achieve their emissions
Yep.
goals, and also be able to reuse water within their factory, which is a critical issue that the food industry is facing right now is the lack of clean
So
water.
can I ask, in a scenario like
Mhm.
that where you and Norma are meeting this founder, I mean, obviously knowing your background as operators, but you're not a food scientist, right? That's
Yep.
not the
Yep.
background you came from. Neither of you has like a bioengineering PhD, unless
Yep.
I'm wrong. How do you feel confident evaluating the technical science and the
Yep.
science risk of this,
Yep.
in addition to obviously the operational and company
That's
scaling
a great
risks?
question. So we've both worked with highly technical teams our entire career. At Mars, I was working with, the R&D folks working on new plant varietals in the field, and we're trying to figure out how do we actually get this out to farmers. You're interacting with scientists in the lab, trying to figure out flexibility of ingredient supply chain, and again, trying to translate into the company. So we've always worked with highly technical teams, but we really do lean into an advisory network to
Great.
figure this out.
Yeah.
So we have advisors, for, a former head of R&D for Mars Wrigley, who's been really critical in working with us to think about here's a technology we need to evaluate. What knowledge do you have, and or who in the network can we tap into? We work with UC Davis, the Institute for Food and Health. So we recently had for 6 months, we had a UC Davis PhD on site with us in this kind of PhD to industry program that the university has. And he's become a really critical part of our team and continues on with us on a fractional basis.
Yeah.
So we really lean into our knowledge and work as operators, working with highly technical teams to get products to market or, to rethink the way business is being done, right? We've always leaned on science and technology in our careers. We've leaned in and tapped into that network to help us evaluate opportunities in supply chain
Yeah.
because we're looking at, everything from computational biology
Yep.
and advanced analytics and how do we leverage machine learning in the food system to precision fermentation, which is a different kind of science. There's a lot of different science and technical challenges that we're looking at.
Yeah.
And so we really need to lean into that technical expert network
Yeah.
to help us evaluate solutions.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and it's becoming more and more both under scrutiny, but also, with the IRA, there's tax credits in all these industries in terms of
Mhm.
how waste is managed, how waste
Mhm.
is transported. And I bring it to climate because I know that always ends up becoming the underlying conversation.
Yeah.
Food and our food ecosystem is a big part of how we emit, but then also in the long term, how we mitigate climate change. So
Mhm.
in your learnings over 20 years in this industry, what is something you've learned that would shock people about the impact that food has on the climate?
Yeah. Well, so food is accountable for up to a third of our greenhouse gas emissions, and that's agriculture production. Then you have transport and logistics on top of it. So it is a huge, huge emitter.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really interesting is what I mentioned before, which is that the majority of our diet now is just dependent on these 12 crops and
Yeah.
5 animals.
Yeah.
So think about that. We have become such a monoculture dependent society, and that is really driving the environmental crisis around our food system. It's not just climate, it's water, it's soil. I mean, it's biodiversity, it's all of these critical factors that we need to have a food system that's not just sustainable that is feel good for us, but sustainable in the sense that we can continue to feed ourselves.
Yeah.
And we've tried indoor agriculture for a couple of decades now. The challenge is that energy is so expensive and nothing's cheaper than the sun. So if we are going to continue to produce food outdoors, and I think we'll have some combination of, indoor and outdoor agriculture, but if we're going to continue to produce food outdoors in an affordable way, we have to figure out how to preserve those natural resources. So really one of the stats that shocks people is how dependent we are on such few crops and animal species. And then that really is driving not only an environmental crisis, but our health crisis. And those two things are so intimately linked.
Yeah. How do you evaluate that impact from a climate perspective when you're talking to these companies? Is that sort of still top of mind? Is it something that you kind of
Absolutely.
dig into as you
Yeah.
get deeper in diligence? What is that conversation like when
That's
you're
a
with your
great question.
founders?
So I was a bit on a tangent when I was talking about evaluating companies, the founder and market, but the third part of that is around the impact,
Yeah.
right? And so, we say we evaluate the food system with this lens of climate and culture. What that really means is we're thinking about the environment, diversity, and health. And our investment thesis is rooted in a theory of change around what the future of food needs to look like. And that theory of change we've translated into a scorecard that helps us evaluate companies on the impacts that they're going to have on health, the environment, and diversity. So not only does a founder need to check the boxes on the idea they have, the market size, et cetera, because we're returns first focused fund, but we also have this impact screener, which helps us say yes or no around climate, soil, water, health outcomes, et
Yeah.
cetera. So, our founders have to check the boxes. These ideas have to check the boxes around the impact that they're having on the
Are
food
you
system as
measuring like
well.
emissions reductions in any way? I know some
It
funds have like
depends.
requirements of how many
Yeah.
gigatons. Like, is-
So it totally depends on the innovation. It
yeah.
it can be under the environment bucket. So, it doesn't necessarily have to hit an emissions target, but it can hit a key target around water
Yes.
or around
Yes.
soil biodiversity, right? Because we see this as really multidimensional. I think climate's become the buzzword.
Yeah.
Just like when I started in this work, it was sustainable development, but it's
Yes.
all right, the same thing.
Yes.
So, but yes, we do have like very specific targets that we'd like our companies to be working on. And it's not necessarily a gigaton reduction in this specific solution, but we're looking at reversing or remediating or adapting or mitigating to the impacts of climate on the food
Yeah.
system, right? Or developing a cleaner water approach so that we can save water within our system. So all of our companies will need to come up with their own KPIs and targets around impact, just like they have their financial targets and goals. But we will co-create that with them.
Yeah.
So it needs to be something integral to the business.
Totally.
Yeah.
What is one unconventional, maybe unpopular opinion that you have about
Yes.
our current sort of food ecosystem and the direction it's going that maybe more
Mhm.
folks need to know about?
Yeah, I don't think carbon offsets or insets are gonna work, and insets the whole buzzword now, but and
Yeah.
we've done a big deep dive into this, hoping to make an investment in this space. Um, what a carbon offset I mean, there's so much fraudulent activity in the carbon offset market. And what carbon offsets mean, hopefully the listeners know, but a company is basically purchasing a credit to offset their company's operations, but they're not looking at their own company's operations to do that, right? Many more companies are moving towards how do I fix my own company's operations as the priority?
Yep.
And then they'll look at carbon insets in their supply chain and then potentially offsets. So kind of flipping the script on it.
Yep.
But I think carbon offsets are going to go to the wayside. I think insetting is something that's interesting. It's actually thinking, okay, so if I'm a chocolate company, because I know that space
Yep.
well, right? How much carbon is stored within my current cocoa supply chain? And how do I incentivize farmers to maintain that?
Yep.
The thing that's very difficult there is there's so much data that needs to be collected at the farm. It's not easy to collect. It's very expensive to collect that I don't know the economics of that will ever make sense.
Yeah.
But I think that if a company starts with their own operational footprint, really understanding that supply chain, putting long-term contracts in place for the commodities, because most of a company's impact, if you're in the food and beverage space, is in your agricultural supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in transport and it's not in manufacturing operations. Those, of course, are important areas to look at, but it actually is in your agricultural supply chain. So, how do you work on your own agricultural supply chain first versus buying credits that you're going to, trade externally, right?
Yeah.
The impact that companies are really starting to see, and I've spoken to many Fortune 500 executives about this because we're helping them look for solutions, is when they start with their own supply chain first, right? They start with something like thinking about precision farming or thinking about new methods for production, or thinking about, how are we going to get our goods from point A to point B? What types of fertilizers and pesticides are being applied in the farm? Like those are very specific areas where we can have environmental impact that's positive and social impact that's positive, but within your own supply chain.
I'll play the
Um,
skeptic here. That all sounds really expensive, right? We are trying to create candy at, dollar store shelf price
mhm.
affordability levels. And now you're saying, I have the supply chain that has been working really well for me, allowing me to create low cost goods that people are going to be
Mhm.
willing to consume. Where is the incentive for me as the operator at this level
Yeah,
to either invest in this myself or work with a startup that you've invested in, that is doing this work for them,
that's a
given the
great
cost?
question. The thing is, it's not working anymore.
It's not.
It's not working anymore because of climate change, because of this environmental crisis that we've created. So, companies can't be sure they're going to get their goods on time and at price. We're looking at like the coffee market is a really interesting one.
Okay.
We're seeing historical shocks in the Arabica market where coffee supply is no longer being stored in warehouse at the levels we expected it to. Companies are having to be way more flexible. Whereas before they said, I'm providing a Central American coffee and it's got all these attributes to it. That region experiences a climate shock or a production shock, and they're now subbing in Robusta coffee from Vietnam. I mean, this is the consumers used to a certain type of flavor profile, and these companies are all starting to think, well, how do I solve this for the future? One way to do it, maybe ready to drink beverages that are loaded up with milk and sugar, right?
Yeah.
But the fundamental business economics are actually being challenged, and that's why all these companies are investing in climate change. It's not out of the goodness of their hearts.
Yeah.
It's because they're fundamental goods. There's so many shocks happening in the supply chain because of the climate, the environmental crisis. The pandemic was a big one, right? How do I figure out where my goods are at? Company we recently invested in, which we're announcing in a month, announcing very soon, is in the AI space, thinking about supply chains. And basically, what's happened technologically that makes this really exciting is we can ingest billions of points of data from the internet and from sensors and from all the other places we're collecting data along the supply chain at the same time. And with machine learning models, we're now actually able to make much more sense of them and have actionable insights.
Yeah.
So we invested in a company that basically helps supply chain operators and Fortune 500 executives understand, based on all the data they're scraping from the internet, what are political, environmental, climate, and currency risk factors of my current supply chain.
Yep.
Publicly available data, but that's kind of scraped and put into an algorithm so that it can be easily ingested. Company puts in their own supply chain, and then you start to get predictive models that are saying, here's where we think a supply chain may be at risk, right? So we want to think about, for this tomato supplier, what are a couple of other options? You want to let your tomato supplier know that based on precipitation levels, here's something they might be facing. Should we help them make an
Yep.
investment? So it really helps you understand current risk in your supply chain, predict it, and work better with your suppliers to try to figure out, what should I be doing? And
Yeah.
the thing is that the traditional supply chain analyst can't do the same job now that they were doing 10, 15 years ago, because you can't rely on historic data in the same way.
Yeah.
That's what's changing so quickly. So yes, it all sounds expensive. And 20 years ago, when I started doing this work as an activist, we were trying to ring the bell around climate and
Yeah.
all the crises to come. Now they're actually happening. And these companies are all looking for solutions.
I
now.
think it's so funny you mentioned that their historical models fail, right? So one of the common conversations that ends up happening on the show is we do not have the predictive ability because we've never seen this before. As human beings, we're really good at spotting trends. As VCs always do is spot trends and pattern match. And we're kind of in this world now where these changes are happening so fast and so widespread. I mean, just two examples in the food supply chain from this past summer: peaches in Georgia,
Yes.
the peach state,
95% of the peach production failed.
gone.
Failed. Yeah.
And they have to import it from, I mean, that's kind of embarrassing. They have to import their peaches from California
Mhm.
to make, peach cobbler in Georgia.
Yep.
The other one, this touches home because my wife and I have, gotten into the wine world and
Mhm.
really trying to upgrade our palate. Every time you go to a vineyard and they talk about a very recent wildfire they had
Oh, yeah.
and how it completely ruined an entire vintage.
Mhm.
So when somebody says, look, if you see a 2019 bottle of our wine, that's a mistake.
Yeah.
Because that 2019 wildfire, the entire vintage tastes like
Yeah.
smoke. And you start to realize that every single vineyard you go to has a story like this,
Mhm.
which means every single one of these folks is being affected. And they don't really have an ability to stop this because they're not responsible for the wildfires. They're farmers and they're producers, and they're not able to produce the way they want to. So
Yep.
the reason I sort of bring this is like trying to bring it home for our listeners. It is already happening at a pace that we don't really have a model to predict.
Exactly. And, you asked about facts that will shock. We're going to be growing coffee in Southern England within our lifetime. Wine. I mean, if the climate ends up being stable enough, it will be warm enough to grow these tree crops, tropical commodities that only grew within a band around the equator
Yeah.
in Europe.
Yeah.
And so it is pretty mind-blowing to think about the types of adaptations and adjustments we're going to have to make. And the thing about food is, 10% of the world's workers are employed by the food and agriculture industry. 10%. It's a huge industry. It's a $10 trillion industry.
Yeah.
And it is something we all rely on. And the technology is way behind. If we think about the last technological revolution in this space, it was the industrial revolution, which has caused a lot of the problems we're trying to clean up now. So the opportunity is vast and it impacts all of us.
Yeah. Now, when I look at your portfolio, what's really interesting is I feel like you guys go down these trends, and maybe I'm just
Mhm.
trying to draw inferences and lines, but you've made a couple of, fungi related investments.
Yep.
You have a couple of investments in water. Talk me through that process and that sort of
Mhm.
research of saying, hey, this is a space we're really keen on. We want to understand how to invest in it.
Yep.
What's that research process like? And what are those themes, kind
It's
of
a
where
good
do they
question.
start?
Well, so as I mentioned, we've got our theory of change. So this looks at what are the themes. It's some of that is actually like crisis driven thinking around investing.
Okay.
Like, what are the areas where there's going to be such crises that we have to find innovative
Yeah.
solutions, right? So our commodity supply chain is one, and that's where the fungi related investments are linked. Thinking about clean water is another, soil is another. So, like, where are we going to see these fundamental crises where we know companies are already looking for solutions, and it's a huge opportunity, huge market opportunity.
Yeah.
We also think a lot about the types of eating trends we're seeing out there. And so part of the ways we then develop the sub theses over time, because you have your kind of foundation, but I'm
Yes.
sure you do the same thing. And I want to hear about how you do this. Like
Yeah.
you want to refine it over time. So we work with MBAs who come from all different industries. We work with these leading MBA programs out of MIT, out of University of Chicago, UCLA, et cetera, to look at sub areas, right? So one recent example of this, we worked with a data scientist who had worked at a food waste startup because we know that so much of GHG emissions is happening from
Yep.
waste in the
Yep.
supply chain. It's a huge, huge impact. Yet it's been one of the hardest problems to solve. And it's something that AI and data have kind of unlocked on the supply chain and procurement side at retail. So we said, okay, we're starting to see all of these companies with this AI buzzword, but like, how do we really evaluate this? Right? We're not data scientists ourselves,
Yes.
like the question you
Yes.
asked before. And so we had this brilliant, brilliant MBA intern who has a data science background at a food waste startup develop a framework for us for evaluation. And that not only helped us think about how to ask the questions, but it also led us to the most recent investment we did, which is supply chain technology, leveraging AI around climate
Yep.
predictions. And so it ends up being a bit of an interplay between what are we seeing? What are we noticing? What are we talking to other folks about? We're always reading reports. We're looking at science. We're looking at the news, et cetera. Right. But then we're also saying if we talk to experts in the field, how are they evaluating opportunities and where are they seeing the white space?
Yeah.
So it's a
Yeah.
constant, conversation that we're having.
Well, and I think as a fund, you evolve based on what you're seeing in the market as well,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
a lot of folks, for context, we met through a program of emerging fund managers. When we check in with those folks a year, 2 years later, you hear evolutions of the same story. The
Yep.
same way that a startup evolves, their go to market, their customer, their operational efficiency. A fund does the very same
It
thing.
does the very
Right?
same thing. How do
Yeah.
you guys do it?
It's interesting. When we started, I think we were a little bit more generalist, and the conversation that Vijay and I really had to have with ourselves is one, because we lead with our PR, content strategy, media value add. Who are the founders that need this most?
Hmm.
And then the second was, where is the opportunity for a small fund like ours to get in at a price point that makes sense, right?
Hmm.
Those are sort of two constraints and realities you just can't get past. And where we kind of settled was industrial automation and climate adaptation.
Hmm.
And that feels very broad, but actually, when you narrow it down, what we're realizing is okay, these are science, engineering, technical founders that do a really good job solving a customer's problem.
Hmm.
But when you tell them to turn around and tell that story on a podcast or get on CNBC or even take a very complex topic and condense it down into a 6 to 8 word tagline that, your Uber driver will remember, right?
Hmm.
It is really difficult. Ironically, being succinct, which I'm not doing right now, is harder
It
than,
is
than
hard.
being verbose, right? So okay, so that's sort of problem one. We,
Yeah.
we we identified that those founders need the help. So where's the opportunity?
Yeah.
Well, the opportunity becomes everybody in this world, in our sort of emerging manager venture world, says venture is only for software companies. I want to back software only businesses. And when you actually look at the broader market, some of the largest successes in our venture world over the last decade have actually come from hardware companies
Hmm.
or companies that have a combination of, hardware that looks like it's off the shelf, but it's actually the software that propels it into being a category defining business. So that's kind of where we said, okay, let's kind of skate to where the puck is, which is software was maybe the last decade.
Hmm.
AI will certainly have a lot of efficiencies. But now to solve problems in climate, we have to be in hardware.
Hmm.
And let's go to the founders that actually need that help. So, I
Hmm.
mean, that's a sort of short story on how we've evolved our process. But we're still figuring it out as we
Still
go, right?
figuring
The
it
more
out, yeah.
founders we meet, you figure it out.
Well, the other thing I'll say is we love to think about how technology is applied to the boring parts of the industry.
Yeah.
So one of the things we're obsessed with right now is food safety.
Okay. Tell me
So
more.
one of our companies is called Food Ready.
Yeah.
And basically what they've done is take advantage of policy passed during the Obama administration. FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act, was really meant to upgrade the whole system to think about how, with all the foodborne illnesses we're seeing in the system, how do we protect the American consumer, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of regulation companies need to comply with so that they don't get fined, right? When
Yes.
they're inspected by the
Yes.
FDA. And so what Food Ready does is they basically take advantage of the fact that we have a decentralized food system. So think about a company A. I don't know if I'm at liberty to speak on their
Sure.
clients right now, but think about, let's just say, for example, it's Walmart. It's not, but for example, it's
Yeah.
Walmart, right? So Walmart has their stores. They need to be monitoring safety at their stores. They need to be monitoring it in their warehouses, and they need to know that their suppliers are managing things safely. So if there's a recall, or Trader Joe's is another example of this, they've had a number of recalls. They can figure out through the system, where did this come from and what stores did it impact, right? So food safety basically is a software. It's a SaaS company, an enterprise SaaS company
Yep.
that helps to collect those data points along the way and organize it into the reports required to comply with FSMA and
Yeah.
comply with the FDA requirements. But also they embed trainings into their technology, and there's kind of a responsiveness to this so that the manager sitting at the central depot can know what's going on at all times, kind of in
Mhm.
a control center at the other warehouses.
Yeah.
And it seems so simple, but when I was at Farmer's Fridge, we would have, an inspector show up and we were pulling paper.
Yeah.
That's just what
Yeah.
so many organizations run off of, or trying to pull on Google documents, right? Like, we all need software. We need these interfaces to be able to quickly respond to problems. Otherwise, you're spending an entire day or multiple days, trying to respond to this inquiry, or in a time of crisis. And so this is an example. We think a lot about food safety. So this is one where we're looking at, like, how do we organize the wreckage and the training over time? The other thing we're thinking a lot about is testing. And how do you do quick testing? Because right now you collect a sample, you send it out, you're getting the results a week later. It's expensive. That's actually not helpful if you have a problem at your factory now,
Yeah.
in your production facility or your packing facility. So we're speaking of hardware, we've been looking at a number of companies that have these small, lean devices that are doing immediate testing into a centralized system to be able to alert when there's issues and address them faster.
Yeah.
So that's an example of an industry. Like, I don't know if other people would light up the way that I light up when I think about food safety, but it's so critical for food. And that's where, when you get folks who have an industry background coming in to be able to see those problems, you can address them. Labor is another one, which we can also dig into and talk
Yeah.
about. But labor is a really critical one. So we're really excited about, a company that we've been evaluating, which is basically creating a digital resume for hourly workers.
Oh, wow.
So we have, part of the problem in Georgia was climate related. Another huge part of that problem is having the people to pick the
Massive.
beaches. So that's
Yeah.
been happening for the last couple of years. We need policy reform in this country so that workers can flow freely across the border. That's another topic. However, the other thing we need is, these are seasonal workers that rotate around farms and pack houses.
Yep.
One of the challenges that managers face is, how do I hire and get the right talent? And how do I know who my supervisors should be? And how do I know which worker should be working on which part of the task at hand?
Yeah.
Because this is called an unskilled workforce. It is a highly skilled workforce. The problem is we haven't seen this as a highly skilled workforce, and we haven't categorized it as such. So what this company does is they've created this digital, basically virtual resume that will follow a worker around, so that very quickly,
LinkedIn for farm workers.
LinkedIn for farm workers and for pack house workers. So very quickly you can match what an employer is looking for and what an employee brings to the table.
Yeah.
We think there's tremendous social value to be unlocked there, and really huge enterprise value to be
Yeah.
unlocked there.
You talked a little bit about the social and cultural focus, and what we haven't talked about, and I was blown away in a good way to see this in your portfolio. Over 70% of your portfolio is Black, female, Latin, immigrant. I mean,
Mhm.
amazing in this day and age to see that. So before we talk about the founders themselves, when you guys set out to raise this fund, what was the reception from LPs as
Mhm.
two female managers talking about investing in female and underrepresented founders?
Yeah.
What did the LP community think about this idea?
That's a great question. So we have no diversity mandate in any of our docs.
Yeah.
I'll be very clear about that.
Yeah.
But we knew that you have two women investing and a woman of color. So Nora May is a woman of color in the investment seat, making the investment decisions, and you're going to see a more diverse portfolio.
Sure.
just like the opposite is true, right, in mainstream venture capital. So, but the reason is we all have biases and we all pattern match. So, we've tried to introduce hacks into our system to surface bias. So, for example, any founder can submit on our website and we'll review the company.
That's
And
rare, by the
actually,
way. Most folks say that
yeah.
cold emails just go
Oh,
into
yeah. And
trash.
we've done 2 investments now. 2 of our 16 have just come in through cold.
Wow.
Right. So we will look at so we try to introduce that. We have a framework called the Foods Framework, but which looks at the founder, the investment opportunity, et cetera, to evaluate companies. And we will run each of the companies that come in where we really want to dig deeper through this Foods Framework. So again, there's ways to try to surface bias and as much as we can compare apples to apples as we're evaluating.
Yeah.
A bit of the concept of the blind resume, right? In a sense, a version of that. So what's interesting about our portfolio is no diversity mandate, yet our theory of change, our hypothesis, what we presented to LPs is you have 2 women investment seats, you're going to find overlooked opportunities, and that's where you find alpha, and you
Yeah.
will see a more diverse portfolio, and
Yeah.
that's exactly what's come to life. What was interesting about the LP conversations is we started raising in 2021, and we closed this year in 2023. It
Yeah.
took us 2 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It was a slog, and it takes women and GPs of color longer to raise, first time funds longer to raise
Yes.
when, and there's a lot of statistics around this. So going into it, we had eyes wide open. Like this is going to take us, we estimated 18 months, right, to close this fund. What we found early on was it was our community coming together that really propelled our first investments that opened up institutional capital.
Mm.
So we had 2 investments we wanted to make. And we thought we were going to get to a first close that was like roughly 10 to 20% of our final fund size. And then that LP wasn't ready. It was an institution. So we said, what do? We have $2.1 million committed. And we thought we were going to be, between 5 to 10 at this point.
Yes.
So what we did is we closed the 2.1. We did not warehouse the
Wow.
deal. We closed the 2.1. We said, let's make these 2 investments because one of our mentors said, what is the biggest objection you're hearing? And we said the objection we're hearing from institutional LPs is, yes, you've known each other. Yes, you have great careers. You don't have evidence that you can invest together.
Track record is
Right,
what the
track
industry
record.
said. Yeah.
But we weren't going to have track record yet, right? Because
Yeah.
these were going to be our first investment.
Yes, of course.
But invest together.
Yeah.
So we did. So, we questioned the decision. Our mentor said, if this is the biggest roadblock you're hearing, you've got to invest together. We made those first 2 investments, and then Bank of America became our first institutional LP. And what was pretty amazing about that is, Bank of America said, they set out after the events of 2021 to say, we are going to put our money towards racial equity.
Yeah.
Then there was a movement of executives within the organization saying, we're going to make sure this happens.
Yep.
And so that is how it happened. And they said we wanted to be catalytic capital, and they absolutely were. And so
Yeah.
that started to open up the rest of the path for us.
That's awesome.
So they really did resonate with this message of get 2 women in an investment seat, you're going to see a more diverse portfolio. And we did get asked by LPs along the way, if this is important to you, why isn't it in your LPA? And we said, we're not going to make it a requirement because we're just going to show that this is what happens when you have diverse decision makers.
Yeah. There's also, I think, as emerging managers, always think of like, we are not an impact fund, right?
Nope.
I am investing in climate change technologies because I fundamentally believe that they are going to build massive businesses.
Exactly.
We're not sitting here from a place of philanthropy.
Mhm.
These companies have to be businesses.
But we had to get over that. We had
Really?
one LP that ultimately came into the fund that said to us, and it was a really challenging conversation, right? Because we're pitching them, but said, so how do I know you're not just in this to like spread money around for good causes? And we were like a little floored
Yeah.
and thought, because we're not a charity and nothing about what we've presented to you, which is about how these are massive industries and world-changing businesses, game-changing businesses that are going to have competitive return. Nothing of what we presented to you said we are an impact investment fund
Yeah.
or we are a nonprofit.
Yeah.
But there is something about, I believe about us as 2 women sitting in the room and a woman of color sitting in the room that just you're automatically pegged as impact.
Yeah.
Because LPs are, and this was a white male investor.
I could have guessed.
Yeah, I know. And I think with great intentions, but LPs are not used to seeing people like us
Yes.
in the room
Yes.
asking for dollars for returns first investments. And
Yeah.
so there were a lot of conversations like that. We had to really, there was another one where early on we were pitching and this person said to us, it's so interesting. You got a lot of flavors here. You got female, Latina, sustainable, exactly like that. I will never forget the words.
Oh my goodness.
And Norma and I text each other. We're like, what are we, flavors of ice cream?
Flavors? Yeah.
Like literally like it became an ice cream emoji. But this is the type of resilience you have to have, intellectual,
Yeah.
emotional, as you're raising capital in this space. And so The day that we announced the close in TechCrunch in July of this year, it was a very proud day because of all of the hurdles we had to get over to get there.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
I think the level of empathy, before I started VSC Ventures with Vijay, I was investing in other funds. And you think you have empathy for the founder's journey, and then you have to go out and face the rejection of raising capital. And look,
Yes.
we have 84 LPs, so a little bit different.
Yes.
We had, very little kind of large check capital. It was a lot of folks that we had worked with and made money
Mhm.
for and been friends with, and they kind of came in and supported because they believed in this vision of what we're building. But we probably spoke to 350. I mean, I could
Oh,
pull up
yeah.
my
Yeah.
pipeline at a minimum,
Yep.
and the flights and this and
Mhm.
you understand how difficult it is to day operate a business, serve customers, keep
Mhm.
your employees happy while you as a founder are out there, pardon me, but getting kicked in the teeth by the market. And you don't
Absolutely.
learn that until you go raise your own
You don't
fund.
learn until you go through it. We haven't done the postmortem yet on Fund One, which we keep talking about doing, but we've
Yeah.
got 600 contacts that were added into our LP
Wow.
database while fundraising.
Yeah.
I think we had conversations with most of them.
Yeah.
I would guess 75% of them we had
Yeah.
conversations with
Yeah.
for just shy of $40 million.
Yeah.
And you do the math. It's a lot of dialing for
It's a
dollars.
lot of dialing for dollars. Sorry, we'll get to close here, but I guess
Yeah.
talking about backing underrepresented founders. So we
Yes.
talked about the LP part of it. What has surprised you the most as you're building this portfolio? Again, not going at it from the specific lens of we have to have a certain percentage, just naturally meeting them.
Yeah.
What surprised you about these founders?
I mean, one of the things that surprised us actually is about the pipeline.
Okay.
So we knew it was out there,
Yeah.
right? But we looked at our deal flow CRM about a year and a half ago while we were raising, and we're like, wow, 3/4 of the founders in this database are identifying as diverse, as non-white male.
Yeah.
3/4.
Yeah.
And we kept hearing, also early objections we were raising is, are there really enough founders in this space?
Yeah.
And we're like, yes, there are. But then we started to see the numbers. It was pretty amazing. So that is exciting, right? And that is completely translated into the portfolio, right? And,
Yeah.
and seeing the representation in the portfolio. I think one of the coolest things is, as I mentioned, we have this program with this executive coaching firm. We've coined the program Supercharge 3,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we work on leadership coaching, management style, and really like emotional resiliency through building your
Great.
business.
Yeah.
So these three topics. And these founders go through the Supercharge 3 program in cohorts. So we've done 2 cohorts so far. There's about 5 founders in each cohort. And the coolest thing is hearing from that. Like, so we don't participate in the sessions and we don't get content reports from the
Yeah.
executive coach,
Yeah.
but they will say like this topic seemed to really resonate. So the next program, let's add another one about, um, OKRs and KPIs or something like that. Great. But we then start to hear from founders outside of the cohort how much they've enjoyed meeting each other. They're starting to share enterprise sales contacts with each other. They're starting to share hiring leads with each other.
Yep.
They're like hype women and men for each other on social media.
Yeah.
It's been so amazing to see that community start to form.
Yes.
And one of the things we've been talking about, this is like a dream of Nora May's, is to do a supply chain CEO summit and get everyone together in person.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think it's surprised us that there's community, but it's so exciting to see it come to life, how much critical support there is between these founders that we've been.
Can I guess at why that is? I think shared experience and shared trauma of raising capital, building a company as somebody who doesn't look like the rest of the room,
Mhm.
naturally, I think
Yeah.
would bring people together.
Yeah. And
so,
it brings the guard down a lot faster.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so.
definitely.
One question we didn't chat about at the beginning that I'm so curious for your thoughts on, because I always think about like as an individual, right? We'll put the investor hat aside,
Mhm.
what I'm consuming, what I'm thinking about. Alternative proteins wouldn't have crossed my mind as something I'd enjoy or buy. When you look out into the food ecosystem,
Uh-huh.
what is something in 2030 that we're going to be consuming more regularly that we don't even think about today?
Yeah. Definitely fungi.
Fungi.
Mushroom-based ingredients.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. So, alternative proteins getting slammed in the media. It's not a focus investment area of ours, but we have done a fungi-based investment. But a lot of just like, this market sucks and Beyond Meat's stock price, et cetera. Like there is definitely an argument to be made about where Beyond Meat is as a company and getting to profitability, 100%. But I don't think that means it erases the progress of the rest of the industry. When we think about plant-based milk, like 75% of Americans have tried it. It's
We also have
15.
like 14 of them,
We have
right?
14
Turn
of them.
everything into
It's
milk.
15% of the dairy market now.
Really?
And the dairy industry is consistently campaigning against it because
Yeah.
it's an existential threat to the dairy industry. I think there's a world where all these things exist. So I'm a flexitarian. I think that there's coexistence in all of it. We invested in a regenerative meat company as well as an alternative protein company. So I see a need for all these solutions. But I think that is one thing that we're going to be eating a lot more of is plant-based ingredients because I do think that the formulations are going to be getting better and better and better. What I want to see more from founders are truly healthy products that we really want to eat, where there's tons of innovation on the manufacturing side.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something we learned at Farmer's Fridge. So when I was running this company, which is think of salads in a jar, right? Manufactured fresh salads in a jar. We went out to survey and figure out who could co-manufacture the products for us, and we didn't find anyone. So we ended up manufacturing them ourselves.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I was talking to an investor here in New York, Ellie Truesdell at New Fair. She invested in Midday Squares, which is a refrigerated bar that's blowing up. Also, same story, and it just made me think about this. They're self-manufacturing
Yeah.
and building a huge moat around themselves to do it. So I think one of the things we're going to see so much more of in our fridge are fungi-based and plant-based ingredients, right?
Yep.
But I think companies are going to have to start to self-manufacture because I do think it's difficult to find capacity to produce these truly healthy products. It's easy to find, excuse me, Olipop has blown up as a better for you
Yeah.
soda. I was just watching something yesterday on CBS. They're targeting 200 million in sales this year. They're doing 20 million sales a month.
Wow.
They started in 2018.
Wow.
So this is a better for you soda that is blown up,
Blown
right?
up.
Now, one of the cool enabling factors of this is you can find soda canneries, I would say bottlers that are like bottles, but to produce that product all over the US, right?
Yeah.
There is opportunity for it. It's hard to do at small scale, so I'm sure they struggle in the beginning, but as they're scaling, they've got the capacity. What we really need to be investing in, and maybe this is where you and I can look for a co-investment,
Yes.
right, is the industrial manufacturing capacity, the machinery, the processes to produce truly healthy, more fresh food at scale that's supporting these fungi-based and plant-based ingredients.
Yeah.
So I really think it will continue to become a part of our diet. Americans have shown we have a propensity for it, but we need to create the infrastructure to make it happen.
Yeah, I think it comes back to what we talked about at the beginning is where are the incentives, right? I
Yes.
think the incentive either has to be a push or a pull. And in
Mhm.
this case, if consumers are demanding it, then the incentive to actually create a better manufacturing process gets there.
Yes.
So where I like to close with a lot of our guests, and would love to hear from you because we've chatted about, I think, some of the more catastrophic sides of what's happening in our food ecosystem.
Yeah.
We've also chatted about some of the more hopeful opportunities that you're seeing in your portfolio. What is one thing that keeps you hopeful in this broader fight against
Yeah.
climate change?
So it's a great question. And I was reflecting on it ahead of our conversation. So I started off as an activist. I think I'm always an activist at heart, right? I love going to DC. I love talking about what I believe in, getting involved in political campaigns, all that. Um, and I think one of the things is that realistically, I'm not optimistic about climate change, if I'm being
Mm,
very honest with you, from the perspective that we will stop it, because we won't. The train's moving. If you understand science, it's the reality that we're living in.
yeah.
What keeps me really hopeful is thinking about strategies for resilience. I do think that humans are an incredibly, incredibly resilient species. If we look at migration, if we look at where folks have moved throughout history, if we're students of history, we see great resilience. And so what keeps me hopeful really are the entrepreneurs in our portfolio and the ones I see every day, because that is who's going to lead the charge in adapting and being resilient.
Yeah.
I think like the ball on climate change is rolling, and like the sooner that we really accept the reality that we're in, the sooner we can find solutions to help us thrive, in the best way we can.
Yeah. Power to the builders.
Yeah, exactly.
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 Shannon, this was a fantastic conversation. One, just to get to hang out with you in person.
Totally.
But also to understand the really complex systems behind what we do every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and dessert sometimes,
Mhm.
and really understanding, I think the massive changes that are going to need to happen
Mhm.
for us to continue to consume the way that we do. So thank you for spending your time for educating our audience,
For the
and I'm
conversation.
really grateful to have you on the show today. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.